It's been 6 years since I lost half of them. Actually, 96% would be more accurate. It was March 2013. My company had survived the Great Recession by a hair, but the flanking attack from my soon-to-be ex-wife proved too much for Octavian Orlov Inc. That was the name of the company I built from the ground up, which no longer exists. By the way, my name is Daniel Orlov. Octavian became part of the name because I'm a big history buff. I also thought double O sounded good as an acronym. My parents immigrated to the US from Eastern Europe before the collapse of the Soviet Union. I was 7 years old at the time, my brother was 5, and my mom was pregnant with my sister. My parents came to the US on a tourist visa with less than $5,000 to give me, my siblings, and me more opportunities and a chance at a better life. They didn't know the language and had no family or friends here, but that didn't discourage them. They felt they were pinned down and took a huge risk by moving to the United States. They burned all the bridges to their past and relative safety. I come from a family of risk takers. For many years, we experienced financial hardship and deprivation. For several years, we did not receive birthday and Christmas presents. Every morning, I saw my parents get up and leave for work, my father returning late in the evening and my mother in the middle of the day. At home, they were both educated people with relatively privileged professions. My father was a civil engineer and my mother was a doctor. Their degrees and certificates had no value here, so they were happy to take on any job to support us. That we did not receive gifts is not entirely true. The first Christmas, my brother and I each received a candy bar. I'll never forget it, probably until the day I die. I was heartbroken. We were so poor. Another thing I will never forget is the shame of being poor and different. In the town where we grew up, there were 2 middle schools and 1 high school. So kids from poor families were in the same classes as kids who seemed rich to me at the time. In reality, they were probably middle and upper middle class at best, with a few kids from families that today I would call more privileged. I still remember other kids making fun of me and my siblings for wearing weird clothes, Eastern European, at first, and then starting to wear things bought at Goodwill. I was ashamed of where I lived, in this small, cramped apartment, so I never invited any of the kids to visit or go to their homes for fear of having to reciprocate later. I dreaded the "what did you do on vacation" questions after summer and Christmas vacations. I didn't have stories about where we traveled, what cool things we saw and did to share with the class like the other kids did. Although I was a very good student and loved going to school and learning, I dropped out of school at 15 to help support my impoverished family. By the time I was 17, I had started my first business and was earning more than the combined income of both my parents. From that point on, I became the primary breadwinner for my family. By the age of 22, I had founded Octavian Orlov. By the age of 25, I got married and had my first child. By then, I had finished paying for my brother's college education. He graduated with honors with a degree in mechanical engineering. I had also just started paying for my sister's college tuition. It took 7 years before she earned her Juris Doctor degree from a top 20 law school. I met Andrea when she came to work for me. She was 18 years old, fresh out of high school, and didn't have much work experience other than a part-time job. She looked like an immigrant struggling financially. Only her family was just her and her mother. Her father, a heavy drinker, had abandoned them when she was only 6 years old. When she applied to Double O, she struggled to find any meaningful work and worked as a hostess at a diner for minimum wage. When I hired her, she wasn't overqualified for the position, but I was imbued with her background and history and wanted to give her a chance to improve. She was smart and hardworking and worked very well until she stopped working when she became pregnant with our son David. I got ahead of myself with that last sentence, didn't I? Yes, we dated, fell in love, and married. I wasn't rich, but I was doing well by then. However, I had a lot of financial obligations. My father became disabled, and I provided all of my parents' income except for my father's disability insurance. When Andrea became pregnant, I was still paying for my sister's college tuition. With 3 families to support, a fledgling, fairly new business that required me to make as much profit as possible, we weren't on easy street. And yet we were doing well, especially for our age and humble origins. Let's move 10 years forward to early 2013. My company was already quite established. In almost every meaningful way, we had achieved the American dream. Double O had survived the first 5 years when over 80% of businesses fail, and had survived the Great Recession when many of my competitors failed. In early January, my CFO and I estimated that the company was worth, at a conservative estimate, $50 million. A week later, I learned that Andrea was cheating on me. The moment I learned of Andrea's infidelity, I finally felt like I had it all worked out. Coming from a disadvantaged background, embarrassed about being different from the people I grew up amongst, I was finally starting to feel safe and feel like I belonged. I had a beautiful wife whom I adored, two wonderful children whom I loved more than life itself. Our daughter Sophia was born 2 years after David, parents who were very proud of me and cared for me, and two brothers who were quite accomplished and successful. We had come a long way from that tiny one-bedroom apartment on Euclid Street. A declaration of war. Toward the end of the previous year, I began to feel that something was wrong with Andrea. She had always been there for me and the kids, but lately she seemed distracted. I was increasingly alone with the kids on weekends, which didn't bother me because any time I had off from work I tried to spend with my family. So when she said she needed time to herself and wanted to go out, I didn't hesitate and happily stayed with the kids to give Andrea some time to herself. I realized too late that this was part of the problem. So I hired a private investigator, and by mid-January he had a report ready. His name was Tom Jeffries. He owned a small and expensive restaurant a few miles from my house. Andrea and the kids and I used to go there regularly but hadn't been there in months. Since Andrea made reservations most of the time and chose where we ate on her own, I guessed why we had stopped going there. I'd met the asshole a few times when he was acting as host and going in to check on the customers. I remember him being a very good-looking guy, smooth and charming. They also worked out at the same gym and apparently still work out together regularly. Rich bored housewife with kids already in school gets into a relationship with a jerk with a flexible schedule who can come and go as he pleases. We had a housekeeper who did the house and cooking, so Andrea had a lot of free time too. Since the kids were in school, Andrea had been taking classes at the local community college from time to time for the past few years. I figured she had plenty to do anyway. Obviously, she needed more distractions. They had the video and audio tapes to prove everything. As I read the report, I felt numb and nauseous. Just when I thought it couldn't get any worse, it did. As she and her lover sat in a restaurant, not his own, two detectives sitting at a neighboring table managed to record a conversation that would play an important role in what would happen in the near and long term. Andrea wasn't just having a random meaningless affair. She was planning to leave me, take half of everything I had built, and move her lover in with her and the kids. All this time I had suspected that Andrea might be having an affair, but somehow it never occurred to me that she might want to leave me for her lover. When I first realized that the report had confirmed my suspicions, I still hadn't thought about the fact that this was the end of my family. I guess I took it for granted that Andrea and I were forever. Perhaps my mind was shaken at that moment, and I still assumed that the family and life I loved so much would continue into the future. Although the revelation had only occurred a few minutes earlier, not only had I not yet thought about leaving Andrea, but for some reason my mind still hadn't considered the possibility that Andrea would want to leave me either. I thought about the fact that it would be difficult for a while, but I would tell Andrea about her affair, and she would immediately stop seeing another man. We would find a way to continue living together as a couple and as a family. But as I read the transcript of that conversation in the restaurant, I realized that for Andrea, this wasn't just a part-time job that she could easily quit and come back to me with apologies and remorse. She seemed to want to be on a new team, and I was no longer part of her future plans. They discussed a lot of things in that conversation. Apparently, their private time behind closed doors was too precious and was supposed to be fun. In between, planning and scheming had to be done. This lunch seemed to be one of those in-betweens. Besides the fact that Andrea was going to leave me and take the kids, she and her lover planned to force me to either sell the company to get my share of its value or force me to take out a loan to buy it back. Andrea assured the jerk that there was no way I wanted to lose the company, so I would just take out a loan to pay her off. He agreed that it would be the quickest and cleanest way anyway. The bastard reminded her not to forget about half of our personal assets, alimony and child support. Looks like Tom Jeffries had found his retirement plan and Andrea was the one. I was just the sucker who was going to fund their future, but found myself excluded from the party itself. The conversation turned to a topic that I had to reread several times to fully understand what it was about. Basically, the gist of this part of their conversation was that the divorce attorney Tom had found would convince the judge when the divorce petition was first filed that I was very likely to move the company's assets overseas, so all of the company's accounts should be frozen. This was a big risk for me because Double O did international business, and the company had international current accounts that held funds in local currencies, received income from overseas sales, and made payments to overseas vendors and suppliers in their currency. It was more profitable to keep the funds in local currencies than to pay double the price to convert them into US dollars and then back into the local currency. Finding out this information was a goldmine. I still had time to stop this action. Before I had even finished reading the report, I called and set up an appointment with Sam Darling, my business attorney. He immediately set up an appointment for me. I thanked the private investigators, asked them to stay in the loop and make every effort to relay as much information from their conversation to me as possible. The private investigators told me that they could not eavesdrop on their private conversations, especially those between my wife and her attorneys. They wouldn't risk their license for me. They were able to record this conversation because it took place in a public place, and it could be argued that anyone in the vicinity could have overheard it. However, the lead private investigator told me that I could always put a bug on my wife's phone and listen to the conversations myself without their involvement. He told me what app to use and how to do it. I thanked them and left the office to make an appointment with an attorney. Andrea wasn't just cheating and planning to leave me. She was planning to declare war on me. She planned to destroy and take away everything I had built and everything I cared about. First things first. I had long ago learned to break down what needed to be done into smaller, more manageable pieces and take on the most important and urgent things first. And the most important thing was to stop freezing the company's assets. The gangsters didn't realize that if they could get a judge to allow them to freeze the company's accounts, there would be nothing left to divide the business into. Double O would be out of business. I had suppliers, vendors, employees, and other bills to pay. Over 90% of the revenue went to pay expenses. The company needed a steady cash flow to stay afloat. This is what you get when a bored housewife with no business experience and an idiot who clearly spent more time in the kitchen than in the boardroom join forces. I hoped that at least yes, at this point I was thinking of them, not her. Lawyer wasn't that stupid. I rushed to Sam's law office and apparently he had given instructions to the receptionist because she immediately ushered me into his office. I briefly recounted to him everything I'd learned that morning. He looked up from his notes and interrupted me. I'm going to go see if Bob or George are busy. They're both divorce attorneys and I think we need one of them for this conversation. With those words, he left and returned with George. After a brief introduction, George sat down at the table and Sam relayed the information to him while I corrected or added some things. As Sam continued to relay the information to George, I mentally went over all the possible outcomes for my marriage and my company. Coming to some sort of decision, I interrupted Sam halfway through. Whatever, let them do it. Both turned to me with surprised expressions on their faces and Sam asked me, let them do what? Whatever they want to do, let them do it. With those words, I stood up and shook their hands. Since both were still puzzled by what had just happened, I told them, I'm sorry guys for taking up your time. I have a couple very important calls to make. Sam, I'll send you a check for a few $100,000 as an advance, in case I need them. I hope I don't need them, but I want the company to have money just in case. Sam, I'll keep in touch with you. George, it's nice to meet you, but I don't think I need you yet. If anything changes, I'll be in touch. Being a fan of military history, I thought about the military moving supplies to multiple locations in case the main supply depot was threatened. The $300,000 I ended up sending Sam as a down payment was in case Andrea declared war and I had to defend myself. With those words, I left their office and returned to my own. The first phone call I made was to Alec Panas, taking risks and playing the ostrich. For most of my life, I had taken risks and mostly believed in the goodness of people. I had two people's goodness to test, and I was going to take some serious risks. First, I was going to take the risk that, given all of our history and all that we meant to each other, my wife would soon come to her senses and come back to me. Second, I was going to throw Alex Panas a bone. The best thing that could be said about Alex was that he was a joker. Although he had no formal education, he was extremely intelligent. He had the same background as me. He was from an immigrant family and had dropped out of school early to help them. Now he was in the business of, among other things, bringing wealthy people up to speed. A couple years ago, I was introduced to him at a party by John Dalton, a very wealthy retired businessman. John had a high opinion of Alex and introduced me with the same pride that a father presents his favorite child. John said that he thought Alex would accomplish a lot and that he was a man who gets results for people like John and me. But he assured me that Alex is more than that, and that one day he will be more successful than he is now. High praise from someone like John, but at the time I didn't understand how Alex could be used, although I liked him immediately. He was friendly, witty, and very charismatic. I remember thinking at the time that Alex could not only sell ice to the Eskimos, but perhaps convince them to make it for him first. Last year I met Alex again at an industry convention in Vegas. He had a booth with himself and a few hot models. I guess like everyone else, the beautiful women in tight, revealing dresses caught my eye, and I went to see what they were all about. I learned that he was an independent contractor working with my competitor to bring large clients to him for commissions. A few months after the convention, in October, Alex contacted me with an offer to do for Double O what he was doing for my competitor. He told me that the competitor he was working with owed him over $1 million in commissions, and they were trying to lower the price of their agreement. Apparently, Alex was much more successful than they anticipated, and they tried to renegotiate the agreement after the fact. This was very short-sighted of them, knowing how successful Alex had been in attracting large buyers for them. At the convention, he invited me to a party he was throwing in one of the hotel suites. There were several beautiful women mingling with a few invited guests. All of the guests were men in my industry. He introduced me to one of the girls and then left. Now, knowing what my wife was doing, I regret not trying to seduce her, if, indeed, seduction was even necessary. Instead, after talking to her for about 10 minutes, I decided to socialize with the other guests and ended up leaving rather early. I hadn't accepted Alex's proposal from last October. I thought I had gotten to know him pretty well in the time we had spent together, and there were things about him that I admired and liked. However, there were also things that bothered me. It was obvious that he was very intelligent, thought outside the box, had the energy of a 10-man, and was an extremely talented salesman. On the other hand, I was a little concerned about how he managed to attract clients. I didn't know anything for sure, but I was a little uncomfortable with the idea that I would bring my company to him and it would end up backfiring on me. I called Alex and he agreed to come over the next day at 10 in the morning. The next person I called was John Dalton. John was in his 70s. He was a very successful businessman that I was fortunate enough to be friends with, and he had more money than God. He was also a man who seemed to really sympathize with Alex and became a mentor of sorts to him. I had a lot to discuss with John, too. A little after 7 in the evening, I walked into my house with the full intention of playing ostrich. The only chance we had was for my wife to realize her mistake and come back to me willingly. Andrea acknowledged my coming home, but it was a hurried acknowledgement from the kitchen that dinner would be ready in a few minutes. Now that I knew what to look for, I realized that physically she was there for me, but at least when it came to me, she was just doing her chores. I wondered if there was still hope for us, or was I just a naive optimist? Playing the violin while the double O burns. Well, bet number 1 didn't pan out. On Wednesday, February 13th, I was served at the office. The timing was interesting. I've been trying to get my wife back for the past month, but have only gotten a lukewarm response from her at best. I guess she found the idea of spending another Valentine's Day with me repugnant. She must have had conflicting plans for dinner the next night. Obviously, she canceled her date with me. I looked through the papers and verified that in the packet was a judge's order freezing all of Double O's accounts. The order stated that there would be a hearing before a judge in 30 days, at which time the freeze could be lifted and other matters discussed. In addition, I had to provide the other side with a long list of financial documents they requested. Interestingly, they did not put a freeze on any of our personal accounts. Apparently, since Andrea had access to all of those accounts, they didn't see fit to do so. Well, now I knew 2 things for sure. 1, I had indeed lost my wife. And second, they had hired an incompetent divorce attorney with more chutzpah than business knowledge. The fire had been lit, and it was time to watch the double O burn. I called a meeting with the general counsel, COO, and CFO. Until now, they were unaware of my marital problems or the financial actions my wife and her lover were planning to take against me. It was time to bring them up to speed. I explained everything to my top executives. John, the attorney, asked to see the documents. My CFO said that without access to the accounts, we wouldn't survive for 30 days. No one would give us a loan under these circumstances. We have already sent out payroll checks and authorized electronic payments to those employees who wanted to receive their paychecks this way. The funds will be withdrawn from Double O's checking account the next day and received by the employees on the 15th. We also made payments to vendors that will eventually be canceled, and we have many more payments to make to vendors and suppliers over the next 30 days. My COO said that maybe we can explain the situation to the employees, and they will agree to an IOU until we get out of this mess. We need to explain the situation to the vendors and hope they continue to supply us in the interim. My general counsel added that we need to try to get an emergency court hearing so that the judge will allow a stay of the injunction to freeze Double O's accounts. I listened to all three of them and told them that I needed to think about what to do. I told the CFO that I would try to find funds to pay the unpaid checks, but I may have to lay off employees temporarily until hopefully this mess is resolved. I asked my attorney how long he thought the emergency hearing would take. That seemed to discourage him a bit, but he said it would probably take at least a couple weeks, if not more. Then I said it was almost the same as an automatic hearing. To this he agreed. I pointed out that it is important that the hearing be held before the same judge who made the original decision, and he may not be the same judge we assign to the emergency hearing if he is not available. This could cause confusion and further delay the case. He agreed that such a possibility existed. I then turned to the chief operating officer and told him that we might have to wind down until this confusion was behind us, but give me time to think it over and I would let him know. The COO told me that if we can't supply our customers, they will go to our competitors. We have to maintain supply somehow. I told him I was aware of that. Then, to their surprise, I abruptly ended the meeting and said we would meet the next morning. It was all for nothing. I had already decided that I would let Double O burn if my wife lit a match. However, I needed to pretend that I was trying to save a company I had no intention of saving. I didn't go home that night. I simply texted Andrea that I wasn't coming home, asked her to watch the kids, and informed her that I was very busy and wouldn't be able to see them for a week or two. She only replied with an okay. We both knew what was going on. There was nothing more that could be said. The kids meant the world to me, and I knew Andrea would take good care of them. That was something I didn't worry about. I had a fire to throw a catalyst into, and at the same time, it felt like I was putting it out. For the next month or two, I was going to be a very busy arsonist and play firefighter at the same time. Being busy and focused helped me suppress the deep, dark emotions wanting to come out. Feelings of betrayal, deep sadness, anger, and loss. There would be time for that later. Over the next 20 days, we laid off employees, contacted our vendors and customers to let them know the situation and that we intended to stay in business and be patient. Many of them told us they would do their best, but they needed to deliver the goods. We were just one of the cogs in the chain, and if we don't deliver the goods, their own employees will be idle. They wouldn't be able to deliver the goods to their customers and meet their deadlines. My wife, her lover, and the imbecile they hired left many companies trying to make sense of the mess they made. 3 people who had never produced anything of real value in their lives left the producers and builders of our society frantically trying to put out the fire they had set. While I wanted to seem like I was also one of those trying to put out the fire, I was actually doing my best to make sure everything burned in a timely manner. Double O had grown rapidly over the past 10 years, and while I generously set aside money in our personal accounts for my wife to spend on the house, the kids, and herself, and to give to her parents, I reinvested most of the profits back into the business. That way, most of the money stayed in the company. This may have played a big part in my wife and her team deciding to take over the assets of the company. Interestingly, my wife only withdrew about $50,000 from our savings account at Chase and left the rest of the money untouched in the checking and savings accounts. She also didn't touch anything in the mutual funds. Apparently, her attorney didn't want it to look like she was acting in bad faith. There was almost $2 million in all the accounts. I withdrew all but $100,000 and used those funds to pay employees, health insurance premiums, and the rest of the company's obligations as best I could. A businessman always has access to lines of credit that he may need. I had a personal line of credit with a bank for $1 million and another $750,000 secured by my home. I requested those funds and used them to pay the rest of my bills to the best of my ability. After all, a conscientious businessman always pays his debts. I realized that partial payment would not help them provide us with loans in the future. They all made it clear that they had to pay first before they could supply us with goods in the future. I didn't throw money into the fire hoping to put it out. I guess I didn't play the violin while the double O was burning. I was throwing everything of value we owned into the fire so that everything would burn with it. Although I had no intention of saving double O, I needed witnesses to confirm that I had done everything I could to keep the company afloat. 22 days after I was served with the divorce papers, I decided it was time to hire a divorce attorney. After all, I was too busy trying to save my company. I flipped through the yellow pages and scoured the list of divorce attorneys, checking each name on the American Bar Association's website to see how old each one was and what law school he or she had graduated from. When I found one who had graduated just 2 years ago and attended a small local law school that had barely received accreditation, I knew I had found my man. He only had one task to accomplish, and I hoped he wouldn't screw it up. But even if he did, it would still serve my purpose. I called him and told him that I had been served with divorce papers 3 weeks ago. The hearing is scheduled in a little over a week, but I'm not ready for it. I need him to get a continuance and for me to meet with him in a week or two, when I have some free time to discuss the divorce with him. I told him I would send him a copy of the divorce papers immediately, along with a $5,000 prepayment by messenger. He thanked me for my cooperation and we parted ways, agreeing to meet again in 10 days. I had not the slightest intention of honoring that deadline. A few rather important details that have been left out for now. The first thing Andrea and I did was sign a prenuptial agreement before the wedding. Unfortunately, it didn't specify how much money she would receive in the event of a divorce. When we got married, I didn't care about that. I was concerned about the issue of control. Although I was very optimistic that I would one day become very successful, I wanted to share that with my wife even if the marriage turned out to be a failure. More importantly, I wanted to enter into the marriage willingly. I felt that a prenuptial agreement that provided for property division in the event of divorce would cast a dark cloud over our marriage. Although I had founded Double O before I met Andrea, most of its present value was obtained in the years after we were married. Thus, she would have had legal rights to increase the value of the company from our wedding day until today. In California, where community property exists, she would have been entitled to half of that increase. In entering into the prenuptial agreement, I was interested in having full discretion and running the company as I saw fit. Therefore, in the prenuptial agreement, Andrea gave me full discretion to run the company without any interference from her. The second part, excluded at this point, is my negotiations with Alex Panas and John Dalton. At a meeting with Alex in January, we discussed bringing him into the company. I worked out a payment plan for him based on production volume. This would allow him to receive a higher percentage than the commissions he was receiving from my competitor. Even more generous when you consider that the other company he was referring clients to was delaying full payment. In addition, he was receiving a generous residual payment for the referred business over the life of the contract. The commission structure he was currently using only provided a percentage of the business for the first calendar year. When I first introduced Alex, I explained that Alex was my second major risk, the first being that my wife would come back to me and not go through with the divorce. So far, the agreement I had made with Alex was not a significant risk. The risk was in the side agreement I made with Alex and whether I could fully trust Alex. For one thing, Alex was a serial cheater. He'd been married for a few years now, and I was sure he'd had fun with a few of his models and probably a few more girls. He was handsome enough, but not the most handsome guy in the world. But he was extremely charismatic, had the gift of gab, and women were drawn to him. It seemed to me that he came from a culture where men thought you had a wife who was the mother of your children and you had mistresses on the side. On the other hand, everyone I talked to and everyone who did business with him that we interacted with, and I vetted him thoroughly when we discussed him coming on board back in October, told me he was a man of his word. You could do business with him on the basis of a handshake and fully expect him to hold up his end of the bargain. In fact, That was part of his problem with my competitor who wasn't paying him. Alex assumed that the owner of the company was a person just like him, and their agreement was sealed with a handshake. They didn't have a formal written and signed contract that spelled out all the details. So while the above agreement was a formal contract signed by both of us, I made a second agreement with Alex that I sealed with just a handshake. I explained to him what my wife and her lover were planning. It was interesting to watch him bemoan the fact that my wife was cheating on me while he himself is such a womanizer. I wondered if he was in denial about what he was doing or if he had one standard for wives and another for husbands. In the end, the second agreement was that if my wife lit a match, I would let her burn the double O to the ground. When it appeared to me that all was lost and the company could not be saved, I would sell it and the remaining assets to him. John Dalton has already agreed to financially support the purchase of my company and will ensure the liquidity of the new firm by injecting the necessary funds into it. I would be paid $2 million for double O, which was about 4% of the value of the company we had recently appraised. Double O's executives could honestly attest that I had done everything I could to save the company. But there was no hope. The factory was idle. Suppliers were unwilling to send us new products, and we had lost too many customers to competitors. Alex and John were paying me the liquidation value of the company. Under the terms of the agreement, the funds in Double O's accounts were to go to compensate employees for the time they were laid off, suppliers, and other debtors. The creditors had the right of first priority to buy out the company's assets anyway, and I, as a shareholder, was one of the last in line. Although the company had not officially filed for bankruptcy, disagreeing with the terms that John and Alex had set, which were actually my terms, would have driven the company into bankruptcy. In addition, I was to continue working for the new company for 6 months to help Alex transition to the new majority owner and CEO without pay. This was part of the $2 million I received. The part where I had to trust Alex and John was that I would be the secret owner of 50% of the company, with 30% going to Alex and the remaining 20% to John. But on paper, Alex would own 80% and John would get the other 20%. And that's exactly what we did. Exactly 47 days after we were served with the divorce papers, Double O ceased to exist. Alex was of Greek descent, and we named the new company Odysseus Enterprises. We thought it was an appropriate name since Odysseus was characterized by his intelligence, adventurousness, and penchant for risk. It turned out, quite by accident, that it was Odysseus who invented the Trojan horse. Jerk. Another tidbit I missed was the jerk. This jerk saw my kids, Andrea and me. We were all regulars at his restaurant. Not only did he know that Andrea was married, but that she had 2 small children. He wasn't some co-worker who worked with Andrea 40 hours a week, and somewhere in there they bonded and fell in love with each other. He met Andrea's husband, me, and children and still decided to seduce her and separate my children's parents. If he hadn't specifically intended to create this opportunity, it's unlikely he would have confronted her at the gym. He intended to seduce her. Regardless of how Andrea and I ended up meeting, I decided back in January that this jerk was going to pay for his intrusion. So, having solidified an unwritten agreement with Alex and John in January, I went to Sean Hicks. Sean was an independent external marketer whose services I've used for the past 7 years. He mainly handled our website development, search engine optimization, and social media marketing, mostly for branding. Sean ran a 3-person store, and at this point, I handed over most of my business to him. Although we didn't become friends, we had become friends over the past few years as he had worked on several online campaigns for us. I was now using a larger advertising agency, but continued to work with Sean out of loyalty. He always talked about how much he appreciated the business I was helping him with. It was up to me to test just how deep Sean's appreciation ran. Sean and I met the 3rd week of January in my office. Getting right to the point, I told him we had a confidential matter to discuss. But before we could discuss it, I wanted him to sign a non-disclosure agreement that my attorney had prepared. Sean looked over the NDA, readily signed and dated it. Sean, you are very good at building brands, getting positive recognition for a company and helping it grow. How good are you at doing the opposite, using social media to destroy a company? Sean thought for a minute and replied, I think it's the same concept, and it's probably easier to use negativity. Marketing targets are probably more willing to believe it than the positive marketing claims they are constantly fed. But it also depends on how big the company is, how many resources it has to counter you, and whether you're trying to negatively influence it on a national level or in a small neighborhood. Well, it's a local restaurant. Sean started laughing and leaned back in his chair. A restaurant? That would be the easiest thing to do. I've had several restaurants as clients. It's the easiest business to screw up. A cockroach here, a mouse there, negative reviews. I was thinking the same thing. There was a Peruvian restaurant I like to go to regularly for lunch. One day, I discovered a hair in my food. The manager tried to compensate me for it, but I'd had enough. I never went back there again. I know this can happen anywhere, and I've never had a problem with them before, but the association of dirty food with the food just discouraged me from going there again. It was literally a gut reaction, not an intellectual one. Sean nodded. Exactly. Restaurants take a long time to gain credibility, and they can lose it overnight. Not that I think it can happen overnight, Daniel. It takes time. A few weeks, if not months at least. That's what I think right now. It's okay, Sean. There's no need to rush it. Honestly, if you can make it so that the restaurant gradually loses business and he puts more and more money out of his pocket to try to keep it going, that's even better. I want him to drain all his savings and everything he has before he has to close the business. I gave Sean the name of the business. I explained to him what the owner was trying to do to me and my family. He understood and seemed to sympathize with my situation. Sean and I met about a week later, and he already had a strategy in place to destroy the restaurant. Sean started out like this. The first thing I had to do was start almost a dozen fake social media accounts. There are services that sell you friends or contacts for each of the various services. They are relatively cheap, but make you look like a legit user with lots of contacts and friends. This will make our fake accounts attractive to other people living and doing business in the area, who we will want to befriend and who themselves have lots of friends and contacts on social media. The next thing I have already started to do and will continue to do is to network with legal influencers in the neighborhood, or just people who use their social media accounts to draw attention to themselves and/or their business. It could be a lawyer, an accountant, a bored housewife, an attention-hungry teenager. It doesn't matter. Many of these people have hundreds, if not thousands, of contacts. I approach them from fake social accounts and try to befriend them. They almost always agree because they see how many friends I have and think they can expand their social circle with my contacts. People with hundreds or thousands of friends usually don't even know most of them and accept friendship requests from all of them. Then we go to the friends of people on their contact lists and send friendship requests to them as well. We spread this out over time, sending only a few requests a day from each contact source so as not to attract too much attention from either the social media companies or our new friends or potential friends. Of course, when people see that I have a new contact with thousands of friends, they will try to friend me as well. For our purposes, this will take anywhere from a few weeks to a couple months or so. In the meantime, I will send them local information about this or that business. I will post interesting facts about local businesses. Not too much so that they don't get mad about having too much information dumped on them, but so that we can back up when we start sending out negative information about the restaurant. I've also started several blogs where I discuss and do reviews of local businesses. Eventually, an article or two will appear there with a restaurant review. That, along with spreading rumors about a friend of a friend of a friend finding a cockroach in some dish, along with negative reviews spreading all over social media, should do the trick. Like you said, people are very picky when it comes to food, especially at expensive restaurants. They will turn away from a restaurant much faster than any other type of business. My head was already spinning 1,000 thoughts a minute as I considered all the options. Sean, that's great. Just one thing. Make sure that if you're paying for something, use a gift credit card. You can buy gift cards at the mall that you can write any name you want on. They'll put it on the card, and you can use that name when you pay for something online. Use Mest Inc. Mest is the pronunciation of the word revenge in Russian. Make sure you always buy these credit cards with cash. If you've already paid for a blog or something else with credit cards, start a new blog with new credit cards. This guy is a shitty chef who now owns a small restaurant. He's not the FBI. But let's take basic precautions to cover our asses. I don't want to give him cause for a lawsuit. It's one thing if he knows I'm probably behind this. It's another if we provide him with evidence he can prove in court. Sean nodded that he understood. After Double O's accounts were frozen, Sam Darling continued to pay Sean for his services out of the fees I forwarded to him. That bastard stalked my family and my business. I didn't own Andrea, but I owned Double O's. I was going to make sure he lost his business and with it, hopefully, all of his savings. If Andrea and I had any chance of a future together, she had to voluntarily come back to me and choose me and us over this asshole. I wasn't trying to push the asshole to try to change Andrea's mind. She needed to change her mind if this asshole was still an attractive option for her. I needed her to choose me, not come back to me by default or coercion. Confrontation. It had been 47 days since I filed for divorce, but Double O was sold. I was technically unemployed if working meant earning an income. Now there were other aspects of my divorce to deal with. One of the $2 million I received as payment for the Double O was to go toward paying off the $1 million personal line of credit I had obtained. Thus, Andrea and I were left with a little over $1 million to split. My negligent divorce attorney had done his time, got a continuance, and was too green and incompetent to understand the need for a scheduled hearing to lift the asset freeze. It's time to change attorneys. It's time to hire a better divorce attorney. It's finally time to counterattack. It was time to call George. Since filing the lawsuit, I've seen the kids on weekends, Andrea dropping them off at her parents' house and picking them up from there. I rented a 2-bedroom apartment through Airbnb. It was the quickest temporary solution until I could find my own place. I didn't communicate with Andrea directly, and she didn't get in touch either. It seems after 12 years of dating and 10 years of marriage, we had to communicate through intermediaries and strangers, our attorneys. George and her attorney set up a meeting in early April. When we walked into Andrea's law office, I noticed Tom Jeffries sitting in the reception area looking through a magazine. He was trying to look disinterested and inconspicuous, trying to casually cast a glance at the magazine in our direction. His and my eyes met, and I stared at him intently without averting my gaze. We stared at each other for about 10 seconds before he looked away. I chuckled inwardly, thinking, well, that's it, bitch. You're a little boy trying to play a man's game. George, who hadn't moved while I scrutinized the bitch, chuckled slightly when Tom looked away. He rubbed my shoulder and said, let's get this over with. I hadn't seen my wife in almost 2 months. She looked well, but tired. Perhaps for her, too, life hadn't been a solid rose since the last time we saw each other. Maybe she felt guilty about what she was doing to me, to our family. Maybe she wasn't as sure of the right path to take as I heard on that tape a couple months ago. More likely, I was just making a lot of assumptions that weren't there, because I still wanted to believe in her goodness. She put the kids at my complete disposal when I wanted to see them, but she and I didn't communicate directly. Her attorney introduced himself as Jack Davis. He and George then shook hands. When he extended his hand to shake mine, I laughed and told him, it's okay. I decided I wouldn't shake hands with incompetent imbeciles, but he would soon find out. You don't want to start a conversation with name-calling. However, there was nothing wrong with setting the right tone for the meeting from the start. This was a hostile meeting, and I wasn't going to play nice. I figured I could afford it since all the cards were in my hands. After George and I took our seats across from Jack and Andrea, I looked at Andrea intently and directly without averting my gaze. She stared back for a few seconds at first, then fidgeted in her chair, found something interesting on the conference table and shifted her gaze there. Jack started with how he thought the meeting should go, and then asked George, I realize that all the financial documents have to be stacked in several boxes, so I didn't expect you to carry them here. When are you going to deliver them? George smiled back, pulled a relatively thin folder out of his briefcase and placed it in front of Jack with the words, actually, we brought everything. Here are the financial reports. I kept my eyes on Andrea. A very serious and stoic expression came over my face, and I stared at her intently. She looked up for a moment to observe George and Jack's interaction, then glanced at the meager file folder. Meeting my gaze, she stared at the same spot on the conference table again. She seemed nervous, her hands moving frantically. My behavior, or perhaps my very presence, was clearly making her uncomfortable. Jack leafed through the papers for several minutes, blushing, and finally asked angrily, what the hell is this? It seemed to me that Mr. Nice and Graceful flew out the window very quickly. This brought a smile to my face. Little joys like that sometimes make life worth living. Jack must have noticed this because he cast a disapproving glance at me for a moment, making my smile grow even wider. Clearly unhappy with what he saw, he went back to looking at George. It looked like Jack and I didn't have a friendship in our future. George replied, "That's all. We can provide other documents if you specify what you need, but I thought we should start with what I just handed you." In the end, my client was forced to sell Octavian Eagles Inc. for $2 million. Andrea suddenly looked up and stared at me incredulously as soon as George said the word sell. I stared at her again, imagining my eyes drilling into her soul. The million was used to pay off a personal loan my client had to take out to try and save the company because you assholes froze all the funds and had a fire sale of the company. So the million will be split between our clients in the divorce. Excuse me, guys, I'm going to step in. George, you forgot about the $750,000 line of credit I had to take out on the house, which also went to pay off business expenses. There was already a $1.2 million loan taken out on the house, so this was an addition to it. Now it doesn't have to be paid off all at once. It's a 5-year loan, so we have time to pay it off, honey. Honey sounded 80% sarcastic and 20% venomous, or I had the percentages mixed up. I had to withdraw almost all of the money from our checking and savings accounts and mutual funds to try to keep the company afloat, since I didn't have the funds to run the business. So I'm afraid they're gone too, dear. I finished my statement by looking directly at Andrea again, but this time she was looking back again with a perplexed and shocked expression on her face. Andrea chose this moment to speak for the first time and somewhat hesitantly asked, "What are you trying to do, Daniel?" "Well, honey, what do you think will happen if we freeze all of Double O's accounts? How am I going to pay all the suppliers, all the employees, all the bills? You might be surprised to learn that employees don't want to work for you when their checks don't clear, and you tell them you don't know if and when you'll be able to pay them. The same goes for vendors. And customers don't understand when you tell them that you're sorry, but your lovely wife is having fun with another man and she doesn't need you anymore, so she's frozen all company assets. That you don't know when you will be able to ship them the goods you ordered. Goods they need. To deliver on time so they can satisfy their customers. That goon in the lobby doesn't seem to be thinking straight, but I thought you had more sense than freezing Andrea's accounts at Double O's. And I thought that imbecile knew better." I said the last sentence while looking at Jack with disgust. When I brought up the asshole sitting in the audience, Andrea reflexively looked in the direction where the audience should have been, and then looked at me again with a questioning expression on her face. "Yeah, I know you were entertaining the retard sitting outside, honey." "Well, here we are, Andrea. We have $1 million to split. The mutual funds and all the other accounts are empty. I had to use them to try to save Double O. And now I'm without income. So you guys are going to have to rethink your demands a little bit. Well, actually, a lot more than a little." Andrea looked completely shocked. Jack was telling George that it wouldn't go away and some other nonsense that I wasn't paying much attention to. I was busy looking at Andrea, who looked like a little lost girl with no friend in the world. I had saved her once before, but now she no longer belonged to me. Now it was up to the jerk to save her. I was sick of looking at Andrea, and I felt like I needed to get out of there as soon as possible. So I stood up and said that, if nothing else, we were leaving. I turned around and started to walk away, and George smiled nonchalantly and said, "Well, I guess we're done. Call us when you're ready to talk again." I walked towards the lobby, again glaring intently at the asshole. He turned away again, and we left. That night, I sat in my empty living room with a glass in my hand. Andrea texted me, "Is it true? Did you really lose the UW?" I replied simply, "Yes." About 10 minutes later, she replied, "I'm so sorry, Daniel. I'm so sorry. I never wanted you to lose the UW. I know she meant everything to you." Andrea had hope after all. Maybe she wouldn't turn out to be the cold, spiteful bitch I was beginning to think she was. I didn't want the woman I loved and trusted for over a decade of my life to turn out to be an evil bitch who wanted to destroy the company I had built from the ground up. I still wanted to have faith in the mother of my children. Then I realized that I had completely let go of my emotions over the past few months. I'm very good at separating people. I stoically focused on what would help me achieve my goals. First, I tried to save my marriage, and then I tried to save my company by first destroying it. I didn't let emotions that could get in the way of my goals get in my way. Now, the slightest gesture of goodwill from the woman I had loved for so long and with whom I had shared the most intimate moments of my life my soon-to-be ex-wife, would reach me, and I would sit down and sob in the middle of the living room of my dimly lit temporary rental apartment. There were no winners in this divorce, only losers. If I could trust Alex and John, and I truly believed I could, then I kept my company in control of it, which was more important to me than holding on to full value. But I lost my family. I lost my wife, who, as I admitted to myself over the last few months, I loved completely, and probably still do. Though I no longer allowed myself to even think about it. I lost the ability to see my children every night. I would most likely see them every weekend. We would spend all day trying to catch up, and only when we were relaxed and socializing normally with each other would I have to take them back to my mother's house. There were no winners in this mess. Why, Andrea, why the hell did you do this to me, to us? And that's what I did. I sent Andrea a text message with one word: why? All this time, I stuck to my plan of not showing the other side any weakness, no emotion. But now I did it impulsively. I didn't get an answer. I wasn't expecting one. She really couldn't say anything magical to explain it all. To set the record straight, to set the record straight, to set the record straight. The lawyers went back and forth. Jack demanded one document after another. He questioned my CFO and several executives who worked at Double O and now work at Odysseus Enterprises. In the end, I think they were satisfied that the company had indeed been sold for $2 million. Jack called another meeting for Andrea and me to sign the agreement that he and George had negotiated. We found ourselves in the same conference room again, but this time the asshole was nowhere to be seen. Jack went over the list of the divorce agreement he and George had worked out. We were splitting a little over $500,000 between us and $3,000 a month in alimony. Andrea would get primary custody of the children, which we both wanted since I had my own business, and I would pick up the kids once a week and once on weekends. After finishing going through the list, Jack looked up at me and said, "Against my advice, Mrs. Orloff agrees not to receive child support, and Mrs. Orloff agrees to put the house up for sale and split the proceeds equally." With the financial matters settled and the agreement signed, I got up to leave. I had a few more things to discuss with Andrea alone, but I decided to do it over the weekend when I picked up the kids. However, before I was about to leave, Andrea spoke up and asked if she could talk to me privately. We exchanged a few words when I picked up or dropped off the kids, but that was where it ended. I wondered what she wanted to talk about. Jack suggested a conference room where we could talk, and he and George took the papers and left. We were both hesitant to say anything, but she asked for the meeting herself, and I waited for her to start. "Daniel, once again, I want to say that I'm very sorry to hear about your loss of Double O. I know how much the company meant to you, and the last thing I wanted was for you to lose the company. I got some really bad advice." And that was where she stopped. She was visibly starting to worry, but she tried to remain calm. I wasn't the only one who could contain her emotions and keep a stoic expression on her face. Gathering her strength, she continued, "Anyway, I got into nursing school. I have enough credits from the last few years to get my nursing license in 2 years." That was unexpected. I nodded at her and said, "Good for you, Andrea. I'm sure you'll do great." It was amazing how we had gone from two close people who could talk about anything to barely communicating awkward, hesitant acquaintances. "I have a favor to ask of you, Daniel, and please feel free to decline if you don't want to. Right now, you and the kids have one weekday after school and the entire weekend. When my classes start and I know my schedule better, could you take the kids more often?" "Sure, whenever you can." I wondered what this was all about. She has a mom she could ask, but I wasn't about to look a gift horse in the mouth. I readily agreed, happy to be able to spend extra time with my kids. "Andrea, just a couple more things. I was going to tell you about it later, but don't worry about selling the house right now. I'll be making the payments." "Daniel, that's very generous of you, but it's almost summer. I need to find a new place to live before the kids start the next school year. I need to know what school to enroll them in. First of all, I want the kids to stay at the private school they go to. It's the best school in the neighborhood, and they've already made a lot of friends there. Their education is very important to me. I will find a way to pay for it, and in the meantime, I have $500,000 to use until I get a job. Let me worry about that. Same thing with the house. The kids are having a hard enough time as it is, and I want them to have as much stability as possible. So at least until the end of the next school year, I'll cover the payments. If we need to sell the house, we'll decide that next summer. Andrea asked me what was wrong. I wanted to tell her that the jerk couldn't move out and she couldn't bring him to my kids, but I decided it was best not to bring it up. We were getting a divorce. I can't tell her who she can and can't date. Obviously, if she continues to date this jerk, she will bring him to us. We've already started socializing with each other, and she obviously not only doesn't put barriers between me and the kids, but encourages even more communication. For the sake of the kids, we needed to socialize, not at each other's throats. As much as the thought of having a jerk around my kids bothered me, I decided to leave it at that. There was little chance they wouldn't last long. When the last divorce hearing was in October, I found out from the kids that the jerk had shown up a couple times but hadn't been around for the last couple months. I couldn't help but think about the fact that there were problems in paradise. There were so many little sad moments that triggered emotions in me. The transfer of ownership of her car. Disconnecting her from my health insurance. I left the kids on mine. All these little final events that one by one drove a nail into the coffin of our now dead marriage. The day Andrea transferred her cell phone, I got a call from her new number, and all I could hear was a quiet whine on the other end until she hung up. It was obvious that those nails in the coffin lid had been driven into her as well. The final nail was the hearing in October, where the divorce was to be finalized. The hearing turned out to be a mere formality. As we were leaving the courtroom, I asked Andrea if she wanted to get coffee. She responded by asking if I could stop by her house one of the following evenings so we could talk. I replied that of course, and we agreed to meet Friday night. She said her mom would watch the kids. The long-awaited conversation. I went to my old house, knocked on the door as any newcomer would, and Andrea welcomed me warmly. She had a glass of Cabernet and asked if I wanted a drink. I thanked her, agreed, and she poured me a glass. As it seems now, back in the day, we usually spent most of our time in the family room, but now we were sitting in the living room reserved for guests. We sat across from each other and sipped our wine. Andrea finally asked what I wanted to talk about when I suggested we meet for coffee. I smiled and said it wouldn't take long. I just wanted to tell her that I would continue to pay for the house and that I would be transferring more than the agreed amount to child support. She had a sad look on her face and just nodded. We both fell silent, watching each other and playing with the wine glasses in our hands. I was starting to think it was time for me to leave when Andrea finally gathered her courage and said quietly, "You asked why." I hadn't expected it, but some part of me still wanted an answer even now. Ever since this whole thing started, there had been a lot of different reasons swirling around in my head. I wasn't pleasing her, I wasn't enough for her. Why was she unhappy with me, with us, with our marriage, with our life? Or was it simply that Tom was a better man, a better lover, more exciting? But these were all just guesses. Now I was going to get an answer, and I wanted to know. So I nodded in response to her question. It really came down to time, Daniel, just time. I think I was more confused than ever. What do you mean by time? That it's time for the marriage to end? That the marriage is exhausted? She shook her head and smiled, but it was a sad smile. She looked at the wine glass in her hand and then seemed to regain her courage. No, Daniel, it's your time. I waited a minute for her to continue, and when she didn't, I told her, Andrea, every second I wasn't working was spent with you and the kids. When we were really busy at work, I would drive 15 minutes each way home to have dinner with the kids and see them for an hour before going to bed, and then go back to the office to finish whatever needed to be done. I was usually home by 7 o'clock in the evening. I almost never worked on weekends and almost never on Sundays. I spent every minute and all the energy I didn't spend at work on you and the kids. No, Daniel, you spent all your time and energy outside of work on the kids. Don't get me wrong, Daniel, I loved that about you. I still do. You're a wonderful father, but the problem was your husband. Yes, you used to come home to be with the kids before bedtime, but by the time they went to bed, you were exhausted. On those weekends when you weren't working or had to attend an event to promote your business, you spent time with the kids. Again, Daniel, gosh, I sound so petty, like I'm jealous of the kids, believe me. I loved and love how devoted you are to them. But every once in a while, I wanted you to focus completely on them, Daniel, and I got almost none of that. I suppose the reason might be that I had let Andrea down somehow, but that wasn't at all what I had envisioned. I felt like I was home a lot. Besides, I didn't seem like one of those men who sits in front of the TV with a beer in hand when I'm home. As tired as I was from work or stress, I spent a lot of energy on my family. But now I realize that almost all of that energy went to either the kids or all three of them. Andrea and I were almost never alone together. There were a lot of different compartments in my life. My company wasn't just my job. I loved her. She was my child. I cherished her and raised her to the level she was at before all of this started. She was definitely an important part of my life and took up most of my time. The other part was my family. Don't get me wrong. If I had to choose between my company and my family, I would always choose family. But honestly, I would try to find every possible way to have it all before I had to make that choice. But when I was dividing my limited time and energy between three areas that demanded my attention, my marriage was clearly suffering. Andrea, why didn't you talk to me? Why did you just have a damn affair? Take the kids and leave me. Daniel, I tried several times. We'd set up dates just for the two of us here and there, and then you'd go back to your usual routine. I felt like even the few times I asked to spend more time with you, I was already picking on you, that I was being selfish. I wasn't looking for a bloody affair. That was the last thing I was looking for. Tom started paying attention to me at the gym, and I thought nothing of it. He was sweet, attentive, and gave me the one commodity Daniel didn't have: time. I thought, of course he has it. He has a small business that allows him to have free time in the mornings and evenings if he so desires. The restaurant didn't even open until 11, and he could probably skip the lunch hour if he wanted to. But I decided to keep that little thing to myself and instead asked a question I immediately regretted. Speaking of asshole, are you still seeing him? Andrea laughed. You mean Tom? I smiled back. Asshole. Tom, tomato, 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 tomato. Actually, we stopped seeing each other a couple months ago. What happened? When it started to look like there wasn't going to be a paycheck, he left? Andrea smiled. That's kind of petty, Daniel. In all these years, I've never known you to be petty. This is new ground for you. No, Daniel, I've had enough. The kids didn't like him, but in time they may have gotten over it. The reason I ended the relationship is because he tried to talk you out of it in front of the kids and alone with me. When he did it with me, I kind of understood that he was jealous of you, so I usually told him to stop and just leave it alone. But I would never tolerate him doing that in front of your kids, Daniel. Never. The first time he did it, I told him to leave and then kicked his ass the next time I saw him. When he did it again, it was over. I nodded my head. I had assumed a lot of things, but the picture I was getting now was not at all what I had envisioned. Andrea, you said he was jealous of me? What was he jealous of? He was having fun with my wife. You left me for him. Andrea darkened when I brought up the fact that he was entertaining her, but smiled as she began to answer. He had a lot to be jealous of, Daniel. You're everything he wanted to be. You play in the big leagues, and he has his own little restaurant with 9 tables. It was very obvious that he was very jealous of you, and it was very easy for me to see that. It was very pathetic, very unattractive. Anyway, it's all behind us now. Andrea said the last sentence with apparent indifference, as if we were wasting time discussing something so pointless and unimportant. I simply said, it was. Andrea looked puzzled. What was? I used to play in the big leagues. Not anymore. Andrea grinned mischievously and just nodded. I couldn't figure out what she was thinking. This conversation was shattering all the beliefs that had formed in my head over the year. That Andrea thought Tom was the better man. That Andrea was an evil person trying to destroy me and take everything from me. Then why, Andrea? Why did you lash out at Double O like that? Andrea sighed heavily, and a very sad expression appeared on her face. Daniel, it never occurred to me that what I was doing could somehow hurt Double O. I thought you would just pay me back. I didn't expect half of it. I thought you'd either pay me back the money you already have or take out a loan against the company and then pay me back. Tom and then Jack kept saying I deserved half. They told me that you'll probably remarry and have more kids, and those new kids will get all the inheritance. So even if I don't want half for myself, I have to do it to protect the children. I didn't think I deserved half, Daniel, and I didn't expect even close to half. But you have to realize, Daniel, that I grew up poor and very insecure. I didn't work and had no income. That made me feel even more insecure. I had no education or qualifications. I just wanted security for myself and my children. They convinced me that you would try to hide assets, drag things out in court, hide financial records, Jack told me that was normal in a divorce. It was a battle. I just kept thinking that with some pressure you would just pay me off quickly and we would both move on with our lives. There was no way I could have imagined hurting Double O. A few tears rolled down Andrea's face as she finished. I know that when you first met me, I had already discovered Double O, but you know I grew up in poverty too, Andrea. So yes, I understand the fear and anxiety you were feeling. Do you know that even after I found out about the two of you, I hoped you would come back to me? I tried to seduce you into marriage. I don't know if it would have worked or not, but even after the investigators confirmed you were having an affair, I still didn't realize you'd want to leave me. Did you even notice that I tried to get you back from mid-January all the way through Valentine's Day? Andrea was a little surprised when I told her that, as if it was new information. I guess I noticed you started acting differently. But by then I didn't trust you anymore, Daniel. I'd relied on you too often to be deceived after a while. Yes, you came home earlier than usual and seemed to pay more attention to me. Honestly, I didn't know what to make of it. Part of me was afraid you knew and were just setting me up. The other part of me hoped you didn't know. But if we met again, you would find out, and then you wouldn't need me anymore. I defiled our marriage, Daniel. Don't think I don't know that I wasn't ashamed, or that I don't feel deep shame even today. I didn't think you'd want me if you knew. I had already done the deeds that set my course. I didn't think there was a way to get off this train, Daniel. It's not about the fact that you wanted to be with that asshole and not him. You chose to be with him, Andrea. You liked him better. You were in love with him, and you certainly weren't in love with me anymore. I think we were both a little surprised at the level of emotion and obvious insecurity I displayed. Yes, I did like him, Daniel. I think I really liked him at one point, but I didn't divorce you to be with him. When I threw her an incredulous look, she continued, Daniel, because of the time and attention he gave me, I felt like our marriage was missing something huge. Yes, I liked him, and yes, I was drawn to him physically. He's a handsome man, but I was like a moth to a flame from the attention and time he was giving me. This man was making me the center of his world. He wanted to hear what I thought and what I had to say. He didn't want me to just pass on what the kids did or said that day. That's what attracted me the most. You know what's funny, Daniel? Breaking up with him was so easy. I made my decision, and it was final. I've never regretted that breakup or thought about it since. We fell silent again, both of us clearly saddened. You're right, Andrea, it all depends on timing. I accept my part of the responsibility and I understand what you're saying. Believe me. But there is another side to time, Andrea. The problem was also that you had too much free time. The kids were back in school. You had a housekeeper to cook and clean. And you had too much free time to focus on what might be missing in your life. I had different parts of my life and I was happy as a clam. I felt like we were a team. I was going on stage and making a living. A damn good living that allowed you to have so much free time to focus on what was missing in your life. Newport Beach trouble? I thought the plan was that I make a living and you take care of the house. At the end of the day, we get together and become a loving, tight-knit family that loves and adores each other and the kids. By this point, Andrea was crying, and although I was starting to get angry and a little defensive, I couldn't help but feel upset about this whole messed up situation we were in. Look, Andrea, I'm really sorry. Believe me, I hear you, and I realize that I should have been more careful, but I think we're both right in that time has become an issue for both of us. Now that you have school started and are paying attention to it and the kids and everything else, I think you'll understand my point of view on this. The people I see most unhappy are those who have too much free time. A busy person doesn't have time to focus too much on their life and make themselves miserable. I couldn't help but think that the old saying that idle hands are the devil's workshop was not without meaning. After spending a few minutes trying to calm myself down, I felt I needed to assure Andrea that I had heard her. Believe me, Andrea, I understand your point of view. I'm not rejecting her. If and when I am in a relationship again, I will be very careful and do everything I can to make sure it doesn't happen again. I really appreciate everything you've told me today. Still crying quietly, Andrea just nodded. We were silent for a few minutes, each in our own thoughts. Finally, I noticed Andrea's movement, looked up and saw that she was looking right at me. With the same mischievous grin on her face, she said again, Daniel, I know you still have the double O, whatever it's called tonight. I immediately tried to adopt an indignant look to refute her words. Look, Daniel, you're taking the loss of Double O too lightly. Double O was too important to you. I guessed you needed to keep it somehow, but I told my lawyer to just file the divorce. Don't worry, Daniel. I'm not going to pursue you or renew the divorce. I'm glad you're keeping the company. It kills me to think that I ruined it for you. I never wanted to ruin your company, Daniel, and I never wanted to come between you and the kids. You don't have to tell me if you kept the company. I pray to God that you did. Someday, I hope to find out that you have kept it, or you will let me know. Eventually, I hope to find out for sure. In the meantime, even if there's nothing else to do but try to reduce the guilt of this whole mess, I'd rather believe you kept it. You're too smart not to figure out a way to save and preserve it all. I smiled and nodded at her. To her, it could mean that she was right or that I was letting her think I had saved it. That was going to have to be enough for today. Back to the bastard. Sean had done a great job working in my favor. Through his fake social media accounts, he had befriended hundreds of people and businesses that lived in South Orange County, where we lived, and more importantly, where the restaurant was located. Each of these people had hundreds and thousands of friends and contacts. Thus, Sean had access to the eyes and minds of a significant portion of the local population. First, negative reviews from various customers began appearing one after another on Yelp and Google. Then bad reviews of the restaurant began to appear on blogs. All of these were pinned and posted on social media and then spread over and over again by friends. Then comments started appearing about cockroaches and mice that were allegedly seen in the restaurant. Sean told me that these posts, which appeared on fake social media accounts he created, caused something we didn't expect. Other people, seeing the rumors he was spreading, started sharing stories of hairs they found in their food or problems they themselves had seen in the restaurant. We wondered how much of it was true, and how much was a desire for attention or to troll the business. Either way, it served our purposes. In the end, the coup de grace was Sam Darling's idea. Sam came to a restaurant for lunch to tour the establishment. When his food was brought to him and his customers, one of them said it was amazing how hearty the salad dressing and food seemed, but all the calories listed on the menu were so low. That got Sam thinking, and a few days later he ordered several of their salads with dressing on the side, as well as several entrees. He sent them all to the lab to be analyzed. It turned out that not only were the calorie counts off the charts, but more importantly, some of the sauces and salad dressings had underestimated the amount of fat by a third or half. In health-conscious Newport Beach, this was big news. This information made it into the local newspaper. After they repeated the analysis themselves and received a report confirming our lab's findings, they wrote a front-page article detailing everything they had learned. Of course, Sean made sure that even those who didn't read the article were kept in the loop via social media. Confrontation with a bastard. A couple months after my divorce, I decided it was time to visit Bastard. By then, I had gotten used to the models that Alex kept around all the time, and had dated a few of them myself. My social life, at least, wasn't suffering because of Alex. I invited one of the girls I had been dating, who was, in my estimation, the most attractive of the bunch, to dinner. I wanted to make a particularly good impression that evening, to have her with me and in my company. I told her of the importance of this evening to me, and she readily agreed to help me in any way she could. We went inside and I looked around. This place brought back bittersweet memories for me. It had once held happy memories of me coming here with Andrea and the kids. When everything was still innocent and Andrea was still my loving and faithful wife, but those memories were overshadowed by the fact that this was where she had first met this jerk, and this was where the final destruction of my family had begun. There was no one else in the restaurant, even though it was lunchtime. Every time I'd been here in the past, the place was busy and most of the tables were occupied. There was no wait staff in the restaurant, so we just walked in and took seats at a table in the center of the empty restaurant. Bastard must have heard the sound of the doorbell when we first walked in because he came out a few seconds later to wait for us. I didn't remember there being a bell at the door before. I guess he was filling in for one or two of the hosts who always stepped forward to greet and receive incoming guests. Apparently at this point he was simultaneously host, waiter, and owner. I wondered if he had gone back to cooking. He didn't notice who I was as he casually glanced at me before focusing on my companion. I'm sure that working in the restaurant business, he saw familiar faces on a regular basis and paid no attention to my person. I looked up at him. We'll take a couple glasses of water. You can use tap. I'd order food, but I've heard terrible things about this place, but I've never believed rumors, so I've come to check it out for myself. With those words, I looked around the empty restaurant. The asshole looked surprised at first, but to his credit, he quickly came to his senses. Oh, it's Daniel, right? Where are Andrea and the kids? The familiarity with which he said my now ex-wife's name, and the fact that he mentioned my kids at all, almost made him wince. But I definitely wasn't going to let this piece of shit get the upper hand. I was here to gloat over the victory. The fight was over. The war was already won, even if the loser was still standing on wobbly legs. Tom, women come and go. I met Andrea when I was still young and nothing special. Anyway, it was time to renew myself. Thanks to you, I was able to do that without feeling guilty about having to leave her. At the word renewal, I glanced at my companion. In terms of beauty, she probably surpassed Andrea. However, if Andrea hadn't done what she did, I would have chosen her over my companion without a second thought. A beautiful face and body were no substitute for years of deep love and intimacy. But business, that's a different matter. I hear you're not doing too well. I'd order something to eat, but like I said, I've heard terrible things about this place. Maybe that's why it's so empty. Tom frowned, but managed to keep his composure and, deciding he had the upper hand, replied, I think you're confused about something. I heard it was you who lost your business along with your wife. We're fine. You just came at the wrong time. I confidently sat back down and, with a smile on my face, told the jerk, what you hear and what's true are two different things, Tommy boy. That Andrea lost her share of the business is true, but that I lost the business is greatly exaggerated. The way I said it must have made the asshole believe me, because his face turned sour, and he looked like he was thinking. Our divorce was final, and although the divorce proceedings could be reopened if new evidence came to light, I didn't think the comment I made to my wife's now ex-lover would be taken seriously by Andrea's lawyer or the court. Besides, there was too much factual evidence to the contrary. There's a big difference between believing something and trying to prove it in court. I had nothing more to say. I wanted to visit him again while he was clearly suffering and preparing to lose everything. I needed to see his once full and bustling restaurant, now empty and quiet. I needed to see the pain on his face. I also needed him to see the face of the man who had taken everything from him, just like he had tried to take everything from me. I have to go now, Tommy. Next time, don't start a war with an opponent who is much smarter than you. Sun Tzu once said, battles are won or lost before they even begin. You were too stupid to realize you couldn't win this war, and you didn't realize how much it would cost you. When you go back to working long hours behind a hot stove as a cook in someone else's restaurant, think about that and me, Tommy boy. I got up to leave, and this time the asshole threw me a baleful glare. I smugly smirked back at him, looked around, and said, I wonder what kind of restaurant will be here in a few months. I looked at my companion, who also stood up as I did, and with a smile on her face told her, whatever it is, we should definitely try it. With those words, I walked out, feeling the stare of the jerk behind me. The restaurant ran for another couple months. I heard that he lost all of his savings and borrowed extra money from friends and family to try to keep the restaurant afloat. This undermined many of his close relationships. I thought about how futile it is to throw good money at bad. It's like throwing money on fire. What kind of businessman would do that? 5 years later, in a look back, I ended up being right about Alex. After the divorce, he hired me as president of the company at a generous salary. In addition, after paying income taxes, he would send my share of the profits to an offshore account. By 2018, a year after the statute of limitations had expired to reopen the divorce proceedings, Alex concluded that I was a very important part of Odysseus Enterprises and therefore deserved a 50% stake in the company. This, of course, was the official public statement to the agreement we entered into back in 2013. Alex has also brought tremendous value to the company. By 2018, our combined efforts had more than quadrupled the company's revenue and profits, and the company itself was valued at more than $200 million. Saving most of Double O's existing customers wasn't that difficult. They didn't have a lot of time to find new suppliers, and even those who had already left hadn't had time to establish a meaningful relationship with them. They realized that what happened was an anomaly, and that now that everything has been cleared up, things will go back to normal. All payments to employees and our vendors were made first from unfrozen double O accounts, and then from funds provided by John Dalton. For a time, suppliers required cash before shipping, but after a year, we were able to go back to purchasing on credit. I have always believed that I have an extraordinary amount of energy and can function fully with only 4 hours sleep. In Alex's case, I'm not sure he ever slept at all. We managed to buy John Dalton out. He had been getting his share of the profits for the last few years, and as a buyout, he agreed to 120% of the original funds he had invested in the new company. John was happy with the profit he made, but he did it mainly to help the two of us. So now Alex and I each owned 50% of Odysseus. I met and married a woman who had 2 children. All the kids got along with each other. She loved my kids, and I loved hers. She and Andrea even became friends. I took Andrea's words to heart and began to make a much greater effort to focus on this marriage separate from the children, even though we now had not 2 but 4 children. But Beth, my new wife, was also different from Andrea. She seemed to need less from me than Andrea did. Perhaps it was because everyone was older, including Andrea, and needs change over time. Beth was almost 40 when I first met her, and Andrea was only 18 at the time. Andrea became a nurse a few years ago and is now a working mom. She started a relationship with a fellow nurse, and they got married last year. About 6 weeks before Andrea married John, I stopped by to pick up my kids late on a Friday night. John was waiting on the porch of my old house and came up to my car as I was getting out of it. He asked if he and I could have a drink and talk and get to know each other better. I must have looked at him strangely in some way because he added, "If it was the other way around, I'd like to meet the person who will be living with my children." I looked over and saw Andrea standing on the porch with her arms crossed. She smiled, and obviously realizing what John was talking to me about, nodded at me. I nodded back, turned to John, and agreed to go with him. We headed to the local bar and grill, taking booths at a far table, ordering a couple drinks and an appetizer. "Daniel, I want you to know a few things, and you can ask me anything you want. The first thing I want to say is that I will never, ever try to come between you and the kids. Quite the opposite. I will support your relationship in every way possible. By the way, Andrea is not going to put up with anything less. She made that clear to me as soon as we started a serious relationship. The only thing I ask is that I care about your children, and I don't want to be just a roommate to them. I don't want to be just someone they tolerate who happens to live with their mom. I'm not asking to be a second dad to them, but maybe a cool uncle or something. I think if you get to know me better, you'll realize that I'm not such a bad guy. And just so you know, I have no criminal record. You can check me out. There's nothing there." I laughed. "John, I've already done a lot more than check your criminal record. As soon as I found out that you and Andrea had started a serious relationship, I gave you a full background check. Don't worry, you passed the check." John and I spent a couple of hours getting to know each other, and I realized that I liked him, and I was glad Andrea ended up with him. More than that, I trusted him around my kids. Andrea didn't date anyone between Bastard and John. Apparently, John was showing a lot of interest in Andrea at work, and she kept rejecting his advances. Late one night, a couple years before John and I met to get to know each other better, Andrea came over to my house. There was a constant knocking on the door until I finally opened it. When I opened it, I saw a sobbing, incoherent Andrea who stepped inside and immediately hugged me and clung to my chest as she continued to cry uncontrollably. I was beginning to worry that something had happened to the kids. But then Andrea finally squeezed out a short question between sobs. "Daniel, do we have a chance to be together again?" That caught me off guard. All this time, Andrea had been friendly to me every time I saw her when I picked up or dropped off the kids, but she had never once let me know that she was interested in us being together again. My immediate reaction was to say, "I'm sorry, but no." Andrea still continued to hug me, resting her head against my chest. I felt her nod and started trying to pull myself together. She stayed in my arms for a few more minutes, crying quietly, and then finally pulled away a little and smiled at me. With sadness in her eyes and a forced smile on her lips, she told me she had to go and quickly left. I didn't think of that night for months, but when I did remember, it seemed to me that I had said no so quickly, mostly because I hadn't had the chance to say no to her the way she had said no to me. I guess the petty side of me woke up in me again, and my immediate reaction was to tell her no as soon as the opportunity presented itself. I honestly don't know if my reaction would have been different, but I do know that I should have thought twice before making such an important decision. She was at one time the love of my life and is still the mother of my children. This was a chance to reunite our family again, and I brushed it off, not giving it the importance it deserved. By the time I had these thoughts, I was already seriously dating Beth, my current wife, and Andrea was dating John. Apparently, she was refraining from dating him or anyone else, hoping that in time I would forgive her, and we would have a chance to be together again. A few days after my rejection, she accepted John's proposal, and now, a little over 2 years later, they were going to be married in a few weeks. When Andrea heard me parking the car in her driveway after John and I returned from the bar, Andrea came out of the house and walked over to us. She slipped her right arm through my left and said to John, "Babe, I'm going to take a quick walk with Daniel around the block, okay?" He smiled and nodded. After that, Andrea and I set off walking and talking. "Well, come on, Daniel. What do you think? Are you and John doing well?" "Yes, Andrea, we're doing fine. He seems like a good guy, but I told him just in case that if he ever hurt you or the kids, there would be consequences." Andrea chuckled and looked at me, raising one eyebrow. "About the kids, I don't doubt it. I don't doubt it either, do you?" "Yeah, you too, Andrea." We walked a few more steps in silence, and then Andrea turned to face me again, a smirk on her face. "I heard you got your company back." Andrea said, "got it back," with air quotes. "Yes, I got it back. Well, half, but yes, I got it back." Now it was my turn to put quotation marks. Andrea burst into tears. "You have no idea how happy I am, Daniel." I wrapped my arms around her, pulling her to me. She sighed softly and relaxed completely in my arms. "I can tell you that right now. My wedding gift to you and John is a house. I've already paid for it in full, and I'm passing my share on to you. I think you and John can handle it, but just in case, I wanted to transfer everything into your name before you get married." If Andrea was already crying at the news of my company, this news made her burst into tears. Andrea was much more emotional after the divorce than she was before it. It took a few minutes of holding her in my arms and quietly shushing her, trying to calm her down before she started to pull herself together. "I knew you loved the house, Andrea, but I didn't think that much," I said jokingly, trying to make her smile and brighten the moment. She pulled away from me but still remained in my arms. She looked up at me and frowned incredulously. "You think I reacted like that because of the house? You think I care that after the kids leave, John and I will have to sell the house and split the profits with you? Or even if you take all the profits and John and I move into an apartment? I'm paying because it means to me that you've finally forgiven me, Daniel." She looked at me hopefully and asked, "Is that true, Daniel? Have you really forgiven me?" "Honestly, I don't even know if I thought about forgiving you or not forgiving you, Andrea. I knew I didn't want to destroy you or anything. You're the mother of my children. At least I didn't want you in a bad position because it would hurt them. Besides, I'm not one to wallow in anger or negative feelings. Investing in negative feelings isn't very profitable. And you know how much I hate bad investments, Andrea." I said the last one with a smile on my face, trying to lighten the mood. "But yes, I forgive you, Andrea. I know I never said those words, but I thought it was obvious from the way I acted around you the last few years that I didn't hold a grudge. I thought you were on your best behavior so we could get along for the sake of the children, Daniel. And I know you're not the type to hold negative feelings, Daniel. But there's a big difference between holding back bad feelings and forgiving me." Andrea took a deep breath and added, "God, I feel like I weigh 100 pounds less." "Andrea, after the divorce, I felt like you should have gotten more than you did. Even if what happened hadn't happened and we had gotten divorced for another reason, I didn't feel that a 50% share in double O's would have been fair to me. If I had a decent job and you stayed home and took care of the kids, I would think my wife deserved half of the assets in the divorce. You may think I'm a jerk, but I don't think that, regardless of the reason for our divorce, you deserve half of the double O. But you do deserve a decent minority percentage. I took the amount I thought it should be, and then subtracted a nice discount for the fact that it's over between us. At this point, the house should be worth at least $4 million. I think that's a pretty fair amount." She smiled, nodded, and said, "That's more than fair, Daniel, thank you." I smiled at the words, "good discount." I was no longer angry at the way things had ended between Andrea and I wanted her to know that. Given that John and she owned the house and the generous alimony I was paying her, which was several times the amount of our divorce settlement, they should have saved enough for retirement. While I thought it was fair to discount Andrea a certain amount to end our relationship, I had another, less selfish and meaningful reason. Andrea had found her calling in nursing. She was passionate about what she did, and it gave her a purpose in life beyond children. I didn't want her to even be tempted to go back to idleness again. I pulled her to me again and hugged her tightly, and this time she began to cry quietly against my chest. When we got back to the house, I put my arms around Andrea's waist and pulled her to me. John looked at her, and it was clear that she was crying. He looked at me with a raised eyebrow, and I told him it was okay. Andrea noticed this and smiled at John. She went over to him and hugged him and told him she would tell him everything later. I thought what John had done by asking to talk to me was such a great idea that I decided to do the same with my new wife's ex-husband. He turned out to be more hesitant than I was with John. It took a few more tries, and while we didn't become friends like John and I did, we were at least in the range from polite to friendly. And that's all I cared about. For all the adults to get along with each other for the sake of the kids. Andrea and I started to get along again, though now separately. We tried our best to protect the kids from the negative effects of the divorce. To be honest with myself, I think Andrea is happier now than she was with me. Perhaps happier isn't quite the right word, but the fact is that she is more content, largely because she found a career that was meaningful to her. And John adored her. He would go to work, put himself out there, and afterward, devote himself completely to her. She seemed to feel more comfortable and less anxious these days. Perhaps it's all about maturity and age. We all get more and more comfortable as we get older. I learned from my mistakes with Andrea too, and made sure that the second time around, my wife and I had plenty of date nights and time alone with each other. Andrea and I were married young, and then found ourselves consumed with life, and I was consumed with my company. I guess I was in survival mode from childhood and focused on my business and career. We both learned valuable lessons and hopefully won't make the same mistakes again. And hopefully, we are now wise enough to recognize other mistakes sooner and learn how to communicate better with our spouses. When I was married to Andrea, I took for granted that we would always be together. But we each have a chance to change things, and it all depends on what you make of it. Who knows if I'd be happier if Andrea and I were back together? Or would Andrea have been happier? Once I made the decision, I always lived with it and never looked back, wondering what could have been. Besides, I was too busy to worry about such things. The end. Thanks for watching, hope you enjoyed it. Subscribe to my channel and stay tuned for the next videos.